G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Wednesday the 5th of January 2022, about sundown. So at about now, it's early morning on the 5th of January in the excited status of Norte armed Americano. And on the one hand, the garden needs to be watered. And on the other hand, is there anybody who hasn't been pondering what the Yankees are going to do next? So I guess we're going to have a bit of a dual purpose video. Events which I have paid particular attention to is the way a fella called Meadows, who was Trumpy's chief of staff, said he was going to cooperate with the investigating committee looking into whether any new laws need to be made to make sure that events like January the 6th last year can't ever happen to the Americans again. For anybody who's been living under a rock or they've just come out of a coma, quickly to recap, in the November election, Trumpy lost by millions of votes, maybe 8 million votes or something. And because he'd been saying for months and months and months beforehand that he wasn't going to necessarily accept the result of the election unless he won. If he didn't win the election, then it must be rigged. And he'd prepared his base for that pre-digested conclusion. So when he lost, he said he was actually winning, and since then he's claimed that he did win, and he floated the concept of the big steal, which has also been called the big lie. Now, at the moment, a year down the track, 34% of the US population, which translates to 75% of the Republican Party, seem to believe, honestly, deep down in their little heart of hearts, that Trumpy was robbed. And they can't reconcile themselves to being governed by Joe Biden. And I've got to say that Joe Biden's administration has got a few severe headwinds. They got locked into running away from Absurdistan by the Trumpists. And when they run away from Absurdistan, and it looked like a bloody shemozzle, exactly like Saigon, of course, the Trumpists said, oh, look, it's all your fault, because Trumpists haven't got a memory. And they couldn't recall that it was Donnie Trump who said 2 years earlier, if you don't attack us, we won't attack you, and we will get out by this particular certain date. However, that played particularly badly for Biden. And then, of course, COVID didn't die in the arse. It got a couple of new variants and it kept on going. So that meant that Biden couldn't say that he'd cured COVID. And by the time we got around to Christmas, everybody had got really sick of a meme on the World Wide Web, and apparently on the TV and in airline cabins, on radio shows, on the streets, on t-shirts, on hats. And the meme was 3 words, let's go Brandon. Because apparently there was a racing driver, a NASCAR racing driver, who was being interviewed by a TV reporter. And the TV reporter pretended not to be able to make out that the crowd was saying, fuck Joe Biden, fuck Joe Biden, fuck Joe Biden. And because the camera was live, the TV reporter said, oh, look, Brandon, name of the race car driver, they're all shouting, let's go Brandon. And so, to the anti-Biden forces, the rallying cry of let's go Brandon has become well known. Therefore, on Christmas Eve, maybe it was Christmas Day, but I think it was the Christmas Eve, Joe Biden was answering phone calls with his wife on a remote speaker, and somebody talked to him for a couple of minutes, All seemed fairly innocuous. And then the caller finished up with, "Let's go, Brandon." And Joe Biden said back to the caller, "Oh, yes, I completely agree. Let's go, Brandon." So Joe Biden has just said, in code, so to speak, "I completely agree. Fuck Joe Biden." And when I heard that and when I saw that, I figured there were two possible explanations. One of them was that Joe Biden's handlers had kept him so blindfolded and so earplugged and so disconnected and so unaware of the actual mood of the US population because he was so bloody busy keeping his day and his diary up to date, that he was actually unaware of the entire "Let's Go Brandon" idea, concept, meme, the fact that it was a slogan that was being used against him by the right, by the Trumpists. Perhaps he really didn't know anything about it. The other option is that he was, as has been suggested, dementing and had become so senile that he had retreated into what they call echolalia. That's where somebody who can't comprehend the conversation has been confabulating, which means making up stories to cover the gaps in their memory. They descend to the point where they simply repeat whatever is said to them. "Let's go, Brandon." "Oh, yes, I agree completely. Let's go, Brandon." However, there's a sort of a kind of an almost halfway point there. It has been pointed out to me, and whether this actually happened or whether it's just a hypothetical possibility, it's been pointed out to me that perhaps Joe Biden's staff and administrators and his handlers, as a response to the "Let's Go Brandon" meme, have gone around and they've found some disabled individual, preferably with a visible disability like a wheelchair type, whose name is Brandon, and they have set up a funding campaign to benefit the particular individual whose name is Brandon, who needs help and assistance. And they've perhaps set up an attempt to confuse the waters on the internet, a marketing campaign titled "Let's Go Brandon." It's possible. I don't know whether it happened, but it is a finite possibility, so it's got to be entered into the equation. But bottom line is, to anybody who's ever had any doubts about whether Joe Biden was fit to be president because of his age, he's looking particularly stupid. And he's just given a New Year's talk where he described his hopes going forward into 2020. So you can see why the people who already didn't like the idea of a Democratic Party presidential win could find it easy to stick to their convictions, to entrench their opinions, to fortify their positions. So I don't see them coming to their senses anytime soon, and we're now approaching the 1-year anniversary of the insurrection. And what's been happening? Well, a couple of weeks ago, the investigative committee let it be known that they had texts given to them by this Meadows fella, who was Trumpy's chief of staff. When Meadows was going through the motions of cooperating with the investigative committee, he gave them a heap of documents. In the documents, there were text messages to him from a bunch of people, including Fox News staff, Fox News commentators, sort of very high-profile individuals, as well as two of Trumpy's kids, Don Trump Jr. and Ivanka, contacting Meadows, begging Trump to say something to stop the insurrection, to tell his supporters to back down and to calm down. Well, that caused a furore and it made the Trumpitonians look pretty sick. And of course, the prosecuting attorney from the Southern District of New York is taking Trump Industries or Trump Enterprises, whatever it is, to court for fraud, just simple outright criminal fraud, like telling lies about the value of property in order to get a loan against something that wasn't worth that much, and then telling different lies about the same property in order to not pay land taxes on anything like so much value. Trumpy's in a world of hurt in the courts. I haven't tried to personally count the number of cases that are concurrently afoot running against him, but I think it might be 9 or maybe it's 15. There's a hell of a lot of cases going against him. He's totally used to the idea that unless he can get back into the Oval Office, he's got no protection against any of these court cases. He's been trying to prevent the investigative committee from getting a hold of the records, and Biden's administration has said no, presidential or executive privilege doesn't apply to somebody who's not the president. One court said a president is not a king and the plaintiff is not the president. So things are going sad for him. His only ray of sunshine, which has to happen pretty quick for him, is if he can stay out of jail until the midterm elections. Because in the midterm elections, it is expected that the Republicans will take control of the House. And if the Republicans take control of the House, then that particular committee that's causing Trump so much grief will be wound up with fairly short shrift. And when it's wound up, tracky moon incisor here, wild native parsnip, 15-year-old specimen. When it's wound up, the Republicans figure that Trumpy can do whatever he likes. One of the other things that the Republicans can do, if they get control of the House, they can lawfully, without Trump needing to stand for election as a member of the House, he can be inaugurated or installed as the Speaker of the House. And the people who want to do that, there's a fella called Go Spar, there's a fella called Matt Gaetz, Jim Jordan is another one, Marjorie Taylor Greene. They're all deeply in favour of the idea that as soon as the Republicans take control of the House following the midterm elections, what they want to do is appoint Trumpy as the Speaker of the House. Now, if they do that, I would alert everybody to pay attention to the fact that if the President and the Vice President are both deceased, then the Speaker of the House automatically becomes the President. And if such an unfortunate chain of events were to occur, Democrats lose the House in the midterms, Trumpy becomes appointed Speaker, and something untoward should happen to Biden, who doesn't know what "Let's go Brandon" means, and Kamala Harris, who's been pretty much missing in action, hasn't been seen or heard of since somebody told her that the migrants assembling on the other side of the Mexican border is going to be all her fault. If they became suddenly Kennedyized, shall we say, if they were to suffer an encounter with the Second Amendment, would be another way of putting it, then Trumpy, if he was Speaker of the House, we would automatically be back to being the prissy dunce of the excited status of Norte Americano, and that would happen as soon as they Republicans would consider it's decently saleable to their public. What the hell that would do to the rest of America, one has no clear idea. One is but the fool on the hill. Anyway, my personal guesstimation is that tomorrow, Australian time, 6th of January, on the 1-year anniversary, and don't we know how much the Americans love their anniversaries, on the 1-year anniversary, Trumpy is going to make his speechifications at Mar-A-Lago, and I think he's going to be arrested in the middle of the speech. I mean, I could be wrong, and I probably am, but that's just my gut feeling. It has been announced on what in Australia is the American news shows that are coming out of there, say 3 or 4 hours ago. So that would, to the Americans, be the 4th of January, because they're going into their 5th of January, or it might be their 5th of January right now. Perhaps it was their breakfast shows, but they're saying that Merrick Garland, the long silent Attorney General at the federal level, is claiming he's going to make a bit of a speechification of his own, quote, tomorrow. Now, whether he's being reported on the 4th of January and he's going to talk on the 5th of January, or whether he's being reported in the very early sunrise hours of the 5th of January and he's going to talk on the 6th, I don't know. But I reckon Trumpy's going to stand up there at Mar-A-Lago and he's going to huff and he's going to puff and he's going to start spinning all of his usual bullshit about how he really won the election and he was robbed and isn't it sad and make America great and save America and all of that sort of shit. And I think he's going to be arrested on the stage. I think all of his cohort are going to be wrapped up and locked up. I think this has been signalled by the fact that the investigative committee let loose their letter to a fellow called Sean Hannity, asking him to pretty please cooperate and explain why it is that days before the January 6th insurrection, he was sending texts to Trump, to Meadows, to other members of the Republican administration, warning them that he didn't think the January 6 events were going to turn out the way Trump expected them to turn out. So it's not just a case of he saw it happening on TV and he got in touch to tell them to stop it. He knew it was coming. He knew it was coming. And the investigative committee has let us all know that a couple of days in advance to prepare the ground, I feel, for something really dramatic, like Trumpy in handcuffs doing his perp walk out of Mar-A-Lago. Because them's your options. Either Trumpy comes back as president after the midterms, or Trumpy goes to jail to sit and wait to be tried for sedition and insurrection and dereliction of duty. I don't think they can get him for treason, because treason means that you've got to act in the service of an enemy during times of war. And, the Afghanistan war was still on at the time, so, you could perhaps stretch a long bow and try that shot. You could also say that Trumpy has always been a willing agent of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. I have a personal deep liking for the theory that Ivanka has gone from the Komsomolskaya to the KGB, and she's always been a deep cover honeypot sleeper agent who was sent to the excited status after the Berlin Wall fell down with instructions to find herself the idiot son of a rich American and see if she could manage to hook such a prey and then push him all the way to the top of the tree with as much help as he could possibly get from the remnants of the old KGB. So yeah, perhaps you could get Trumpy for treason, for having a wife who was an enemy agent and being in the thrall of the president of Russia. So it's going to be an interesting 48 hours, I would say. And after that, it's all going to get more interesting, because COVID's bloody out of control all over the world. We get to the point where either the politicians have been completely entranced and captured by the busyness lobby, the financiers, the people whose busyness plans aren't working, and they say we just have to get the economy back on track as fast as possible, and we can tell everybody that Omicron's going to be really mild and it'll be fine, because that's what the politicians are trying to tell the people. Trouble is, if you're doing contact tracing, if you're doing QR code tracking, if you're doing tracking and tracing of all of the people who've got the bug, if you're doing 14-day isolation, if you've got density limits on restaurants, if you're making people wear masks indoors and out, if you've got people working from home, if you're doing all of the things that you can do to reduce transmission, and you're getting 250 cases a day, and then you take all of those viral transmission controls off for the sake of having a happy Christmas, and now you've got 34,000 cases a day, then it doesn't matter if the new virus, which is twice as transmissible as Delta, doesn't matter if it's only a third or a quarter as likely to cause an illness. If you've got 100 times more cases and only a quarter of them need to go to hospital, that still means that the hospital that was as full as a goog and had no room for any extra increase in patients, if it was as full as a goog at 250 new cases a day, then God help you if you go into hospital in New South Wales at the moment and you might have a heart attack or a stroke or something that requires urgent attention, because half the staff are off in self-isolation because they've already tested positive to COVID, or they're classed as a close contact because they've nursed somebody with COVID and they didn't know they were nursing someone with COVID because the testing's lagging behind. So they're off self-isolating, although apparently some of the hospital staff, hospital managers have been calling people in and telling them, don't worry about the fact that you're COVID positive, you haven't got any symptoms, so just wear your PPE and go to work anyway. So the hospitals are spreading COVID. They've taken off all of the social controls and, well, the staff are burnt out. My own doctor is quitting on the 13th the next month. So I've got to find another doctor. So I went off to the medical centre, the practice where I used to be one of their patients, handed in the application, and then last week I hear that one of their doctors has said to the hospital, no, don't come calling me for emergency work in the middle of the night. I'm not going to turn up for any more of that. I need to have a life of my own. Apparently part of the problem is that whereas 40 or 50 years ago, 3/4 or 80% of medical students were male, 30, 40 years ago, that changed to 50% of the medical students being female, and now half the doctors are female, and the women want to have some quality of life, so they've put their little foot down, and the men have seen that the women can get away with it, so now the male doctors, they want to have some quality of life as well. But the whole system was built on the assumption that you could get doctors to work two 24-hour shifts, no, two 12-hour shifts back to back at a hospital, and then they would work another 24 hours on call. And the rationale is that so that when the atom bombs drop from the sky, they'll be able to cope with the vast numbers of civilian casualties like the doctors had to do at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, all of the doctors who were raised under those principles are just about ready to retire, or they have retired. The younger ones aren't interested in the proposition. They want some personal quality of life. And the nurses, well, I am the last hospital-trained nurse in New South Wales to graduate from Concord Repat. 3 months after me, the nurses at Concord started going out to Hawkesbury CAE. So their lecture blocks ran for 8 weeks instead of 4 weeks. They did half the time on the wards. At the end of their 3 years, they'd still go looking for a left-handed colostomy bag, or 2 metres of fallopian tubing, or a bottle of Bowman's capsules, and everybody who's got a medical terminology education should be laughing and rolling on the floor. But you could do it to them after 3 years of nursing training. The way that happened was the New South Wales Nurses Association said to the New South Wales Premier, hey, listen, Nifty, if you do what we want and make nursing something that you have to go to university or college to do, you can take 5,000 student nurses, cut them off the state health payroll and dump them all on the federal education budget. And Nifty Nev said, what a good idea. So, 35 years ago, the people who were actually delivering the face-to-face nursing care in the big teaching hospitals disappeared. It took 3 years for us to have no student nurses because they were all off sitting in a lecture room not learning how to be a nurse, not discovering what it's like to be in charge of a ward. Initially, it looked pretty good. Instead of having 50% of the people who start the training school dropping out during the 3 years of training, they found that 60 or 70 or maybe 80% of people were lasting the 3 years at the College of Education. However, after they popped out and they got onto the wards and they found they had to work supernumerary unpaid for 3 months, sometimes 6 months, following somebody who could actually do the job in order to come up to speed, and then they found out how much hard work it is to be a nurse, 60% of the people who graduated were no longer working as a nurse 1 year later because they decided to turn back and go into academia again and study something else and get another degree. And whatever they do after nursing, it's not go onto the wards and wipe bums and deliver bedpans. So that's pretty much why the hospital system, even before COVID, had absolutely no fat in the system. Australia's healthcare industry was gutted from about 1986 on, because that's when they abolished all requirements as to having a registered nurse in charge of each shift on each ward. So yeah, good luck with COVID. My advice to everybody is just try not to catch it. Apply aseptic technique and discipline to your own life and get a really good mask, and then buy a packet of 10 of the bloody things. N95, P95, K95, the idea is it's got to stop 95% of everything down to 2 microns. And then you have to wear it with discipline. Treat it like your mother-in-law's underpants. Once it goes on, you don't pat it or pet it or touch it or scratch it or tickle it or play with it. Because at the moment, the vaccine won't stop you from getting the disease, and the vaccine won't stop you from transmitting the disease. It will reduce your chances of dying by a factor of 11. But being vaccinated does not make you safe from COVID. Admittedly, most of the people who are in hospital and most of the people who are dying are the unvaccinated. And who knows, maybe the unvaccinated have been selected for culling by whoever it is who decided to suck them into the counterfactualist rhetoric, which calls science fake news and claims that epidemiologists don't know what they're talking about. It is as if a large fraction of the leaders of humanity are playing on the side of the bats. Now, I mean, I salute the bats' tactics. I salute the bats' strategy. I understand that from their point of view as a species, anything that reduces the number of bat eaters is a good thing. If you look at the number of species that are on the rare and threatened or the critically endangered list, you can understand why the rest of the biosphere wants to cut down the number of humans who are consuming resources and generating pollution and adding to the anthropogenic global warming. But the fact is, I am a human and I have a duty and a responsibility to my own species to try not to transmit the bat eater's lament virus. And sadly, our politicians don't seem to get that. I have a pet personal hypothesis that the problem in Australia is that we have an evangelistic Pentecostal Prime Minister. The Pentecostal Church of speaking in tongues and foaming at the mouth, who believes that Gott mit uns, God is on our side. No matter what Morrison decides to do on earth, he expects his God theory to tick off on it afterwards in heaven, because Gott mit uns. Surely, Gott mit uns. And what's happened in New South Wales? Who was it who turned New South Wales from 250 cases a day to 34,000 cases a day? Dominic Perrottet. Looks like dummy Nick Perrottet, but they tell us we got to call him Perrottet. He is a member of a Catholic schismatic breakaway group called Opus Dei, which means the work of God, doing God's work, Opus Dei. Functionally, Opus Dei is the Catholic Taliban wing of the Chamber of Commerce. Even back before he became Premier, Dominic Perrottet was the one person who was against masks, who was against lockdowns, who was against social distancing, who was against quarantine, who was against border shutdowns. He was against anything which was going to actually help at a virological or epidemiological level to suppress COVID. Presumably, he thinks God's work consists of reducing the 8 billion we share the planet with down to as little as possible. But the immediate fascination is whether the Americans are going to arrest Donald Trump tomorrow, or whether they're going to let Donald Trump run around making a prick of himself until he has a go at being reinstated after the midterm elections. First as appointed as Speaker of the House, and then when, oh, shock horror, what a surprise, something horrible has happened to Biden and Harris. We'll have to have Donnie go back in there and open up the White House. So there you go. That's my tentative forecast. It's not actually a prediction, and it's certainly not a prophecy, but it's what I think might be about to happen. Warbles on a lot to YouTube, watering the garden at sunset. Ciao.